The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of History Nebraska. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine by History Nebraska. On this episode, we look back at an article written in 1992 by Douglas Hartman. Today, let's look back at the history of Nebraska's Lost Battalion. The 134th Infantry Regiment, one of 4 infantry regiments in the 35th Division, was a Nebraska National Guard unit mobilized on December 23, 1940 for 1 year of preparedness training. After Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 4, 1941, the 134th was immediately transferred to California and assigned to the Western Defense Command. In 1942, the 134th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion was selected for a top-secret mission in the Aleutian Islands. During its mission, the battalion was absorbed into another unit, redesignated in 1943 as 2nd Battalion, 197th Infantry, and returned to the U.S. mainland in 1944. The 197th was then dissolved, and its soldiers used as cadre to form new regiments or as replacements for existing units. When it became evident that the 2nd Battalion would not rejoin the 134th Infantry Regiment, the regiment organized a new 2nd Battalion to replace what has become known as the 134th's Lost Battalion. The Aleutian Island chain extends westward from the tip of Alaska's peninsula in an arc for approximately 1,000 miles. Each island in the chain is mountainous, rising several thousand feet above sea level. There are no trees on any of the islands, which were formed from volcanic ash and topped with spongy mat of vegetation called tundra. These characteristically bleak islands are completely covered by fog much of the time and battered by violent winds that can bring rain, snow, or mist year-round. The thin layer of tundra and volcanic ash turns into mud following any precipitation. The rough terrain and unique subsoil make construction on the islands difficult, while poor weather renders aerial reconnaissance an unreliable source of intelligence. These desolate, largely uninhabited islands became significant to both the United States and Japan during the early months of 1942 as the Japanese expanded across the Pacific. Since its attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had captured Guam, Indochina, Thailand, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, Java, Burma, and the Philippines. Its armies had invaded the Solomons and were in New Guinea. The British fleet had been driven from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. What was left of America's sea power after the battles of Wake Island and Coral Sea was forced back to Hawaii and the West Coast. U.S. strategy during these months revolved around a frail line of defense which began in the south at New Guinea, extended to the northwest through Samoa and Midway Island, and was anchored in the north at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians. Japan's expansion in the Pacific was directly related to its primary strategy of luring the United States into a decisive naval battle and destroying the Pacific Fleet. The Aleutians became a Japanese target soon after General James Doolittle's raid on Tokyo on April 18, 1942. The Japanese believed that Doolittle's land-based bombers had taken off from the western Aleutians, only 650 miles from Japan's Kuril Islands. They surmised that because Doolittle, the son of an Alaskan gold miner, had grown up in Nome, he had launched his attack from familiar territory. The Japanese did not learn until after the war that Doolittle's bombers had flown from Admiral William Halsey's carriers in the Central Pacific. In May, the Japanese devised a plan to protect their northern flank and destroy the U.S. fleet. A multiple task force would attack Dutch Harbor, while a landing force invaded the western Aleutians. Japan hoped that this would lure the U.S. fleet out of Pearl Harbor. Then, Admiral Yamato and the Japanese fleet of 190 ships and over 700 aircraft would ambush the Americans at Midway. The United States suspected that Japan would retaliate for the Doolittle raid with some sort of attack upon the West Coast or on Alaska. Because the Japanese code had been broken, U.S. military planners predicted that Japan would attack the Aleutians around June 1st, but correctly concluded that the Aleutian attack was a diversion and that the crucial battle would involve Midway. On June 3rd and 4th, a Japanese naval task force bombed Dutch Harbor in the opening phase of the Midway campaign. However, the forewarned U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers and destroyed over 300 planes at Midway on June 4th and 5th. Despite this disaster, the Japanese landed troops on the islands of Attu and Kiska on June 7th. Their defeat at Midway made control of the Aleutians of less importance to the Japanese. Nevertheless, the occupation did block any potential U.S. offensive against Japan from the north. Japan decided to fortify the captured islands and possibly expand eastward if the opportunity presented itself. From the American perspective, the Japanese presence in the Aleutians threatened U.S. supply lines to the Soviet Union. Moreover, the invasion of Kiska and Attu represented a psychological defeat because for the first time, Japan had penetrated the Western Hemisphere's defenses and actually occupied U.S. territory. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, commander of the 4th Army, which included the Alaska Defense Command, was charged with protecting the West Coast and Alaska from Japanese attack and sabotage. He believed that Japan was preparing for an eastward offensive to capture the American base at Dutch Harbor. DeWitt immediately began planning a large, multi-service operation involving thousands of sailors, soldiers, and Marines to establish an advanced air base and resupply point on one of the westernmost islands in the Aleutian chain. This would counter expected Japanese advances and serve as a jumping-off point for U.S. efforts to retake Attu and Kiska. However, DeWitt's grandiose plans were scaled down when the War Department decided not to commit a large force to an Aleutian offensive. The department believed that, quote, the Aleutian situation was of little consequence and Alaska a minor theater of operations, end quote. Consequently, any offensive operations in the Aleutians had to be carried out with men and equipment already under DeWitt's command. On July 16, 1942, after considerable engineer reconnaissance, DeWitt chose Tanaga Island, located about 180 miles east of Kiska, as the best location for the construction of an airfield and advanced supply base. The Navy responded that, although Tanaga would make a good airfield, it could not accommodate large naval vessels. The Navy preferred Attuck Island as the site for the advanced base. However, Attuck's rough terrain would make construction of an airfield more difficult, and it was 60 miles farther east than Tanaga. After careful consideration of all factors, the Joint Chiefs of Staff decided that Tanaga remained the best location. For the initial landing, DeWitt formed a task force of 4,500 men, which included an assortment of infantry and artillery elements from the West Coast. He asked Major General Maxwell Murray, commander of the 35th Division, to supply the infantry battalion around which the remainder of the task force could be formed. In turn, Murray called on the 134th Regiment's commander, North Platte native Colonel Butler B. Miltenberger, to provide one reinforced battalion for a, quote, top-secret mission. The operation was so secret that verbal orders were issued from General DeWitt down to the regimental level. Such secrecy hinged upon the belief that Japan possessed an excellent intelligence system on the West Coast. The United States thought it had repeatedly bombed and strafed the Japanese on Kiska, but did not want to give them any indication that it was preparing to contest the enemy occupation of the Aleutians. Speed in establishing an American presence in the islands was another reason for the verbal orders. Miltenberger chose 2nd Battalion for the special mission because it was the best trained of the regiment's 3 battalions. It consisted of Nebraska National Guard companies from Omaha, Scottsbluff, Hastings, Gering, and Grand Island. 2nd Battalion was immediately brought up to its authorized strength of 1,100 men with fillers from the remainder of the 134th. A cannon platoon, an anti-tank platoon, one section from the transportation platoon, one section of the medical detachment, one mine squad, 2 chaplains, a mail clerk, a mechanic, and a supply man were also attached to the unit. Colonel Miltenberger and the remainder of the 134th were proud that the 2nd Battalion had been selected for such an important mission. Morale was very high, recalled Sergeant Louis W. Schaefer, because we were picked over everyone else in the 35th Division. The enthusiasm and pride of the moment, combined with an understanding that 2nd Battalion would return to the 134th upon completion of its assignment, made it easier for the 134th's commander to part with the unit. 2nd Battalion, commanded by Frank Dunkley, was temporarily assigned to the 53rd Composite Regiment commanded by General Eugene Landrum. The 53rd also included 1st Battalion of the 53rd Infantry and 3rd Battalion of the 153rd Regiment. Technically, all three battalions remained part of their original units, but were on loan for the duration of their special service. On July 24th, 2nd Battalion, 134th Infantry, was ordered to Ojai, California, where the men prepared for overseas movement, culminating in a full-dressed inspection on August 1st. The unit went by train to San Francisco, where it arrived on August 2nd at 11 p.m. The battalion was immediately loaded on boats under the cover of darkness and taken to Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. The men spent 8 days on Angel Island getting rid of excess equipment, checking their records, receiving inoculations, and drawing new combat gear. 2nd Battalion's, quote, normal issue of clothing consisted of wool overcoat, cloth 2-buckled overshoes, a wool pea cap, a set of long underwear, brown shoes with canvas leggings, and wool olive drab pants and shirts. However, no foul weather gear was issued other than a garrison raincoat, which eventually proved inadequate for the Aleutian winters. The raincoat was too short to keep soldiers dry below the waist and quickly came apart at the seams in the constant moisture. On August 12th, 2nd Battalion boarded small transport boats and was ferried to the Oakland port of embarkation. The next day, the battalion, aboard the J. Franklin Bell, departed San Francisco Bay via the Golden Gate Bridge for its unknown destination. The J. Franklin Bell was once a luxury liner named the SS President McKinley before it was converted into a troop ship. It carried a crew of 600, 2,100 troops from the 53rd Composite Regiment, and a load of supplies. Explosives, ammunition, and gasoline were packed in the holds side by side with the men. The Nebraskans worried about what would happen if they were attacked by submarines while carrying all of this flammable material. However, the soldiers' main concern was seasickness, which struck 90% of the battalion. The 53rd Composite was escorted to Alaska by several converted, lightly armed fishing boats. It looked like a big armada from the distance, recalled Sergeant Kenneth J. Walker, but up close it was pretty scroungy escort with not much firepower. On August 19th, the Bell finally anchored in the harbor of the Kodiak Island, located approximately 40 miles south of Alaska's mainland near the entrance to Cook Inlet. 2nd Battalion's 5 days at Kodiak were devoted to training on the proper loading of landing craft and on day and night amphibious landings. The soldiers practiced several repetitions of descending rope ladders into assault craft, which in turn dropped them off in cold, waist-deep water. The men waded ashore, small boats picked them up, and they were returned to the transports to repeat the whole process. After 2 days of training, Tanaga Island was finally confirmed as the regiment's objective. The units were supplied with maps of the designated island and preliminary plans were drawn up for the assault. However, prior to the troops' departure from Kodiak, the Joint Chiefs of Staff reversed their earlier decision to land on Tanaga. The Navy had convinced the chiefs that a Tanaga landing presented serious navigational hazards and offshore support for the Army could not be guaranteed. Attic Island, part of the Andreanof Island group, was chosen as 2nd Battalion's new objective. Attic, located 275 miles east of Kiska, was an extremely rugged island with numerous mountains reaching over 2,000 feet above sea level. It was dominated by 3,924-foot Mount Moffett. The only level area was a place called Sweeper Cove, which was usually flooded during high tide. On August 25th, as revised preparations for the Attic assault continued, 2nd Battalion left Kodiak Harbor and began the 5-day journey to Attic. Its mission was to secure Attic and remain on the island to provide security while the Navy constructed a port, a runway, and a base from which to attack Japanese-controlled Attu and Kiska. Sunday, August 30th, was the scheduled landing. D-Day began at 1:30 a.m. with breakfast, followed by an equipment check, combat loading, and readying assault boats. At 6 a.m., troops embarked in small landing craft that were tossed around like wash tubs en route to the beach. The first elements of 2nd Battalion landed unopposed on Attic after half an hour's battle with the ice-cold choppy waters. The battalion's assault on Attic was the U.S. Army's first amphibious landing of World War II. When the battalion came ashore, the men immediately unloaded the landing boats, discarded their flat, rubberized, waist-fitting life belts, and prepared to fight any Japanese who might have landed on the island undetected. After a quick reconnaissance failed to turn up any enemies, the landing of additional troops, supplies, and equipment was called off because of high seas, poor visibility, and 100-mile-per-hour wind gusts. This placed 2nd Battalion in a vulnerable situation. It could not return to the transports, while additional men and supplies could not land on Attic. The battalion established a defensive perimeter on the landing beach the first night, while the soldiers erected 2-man pup tents for protection from the elements. Some men were low on food and scavenged emergency 10-in-1 rations from the landing crafts. Others tried to find something to burn on the barren island which would keep them warm during that first cold, wet, and windy night. The few men picked up previous discarded rubber life belts, cut them up, and burned them in their tents. According to Sergeant George Thiel, quote, "This turned out to be a mistake because burning the rubber turned them black," end quote. Several veterans of the Aleutian campaign called their first night on Attic, quote, "the worst they have ever spent in their lives," end quote. The weather improved on day 2, allowing other elements of the landing party to come ashore and unload equipment and supplies. However, a barge containing some steel matting for the airstrip capsized in the rough waters. Meanwhile, 2nd Battalion sloshed a mile inland through knee-deep mud to set up a command post in a ravine. On the grueling trek, some of the men encountered a stream so packed with fish, quote, "you could catch them with your hands," end quote. "The fish were spawning when we landed," explained Walker, "so all we had to do was reach in and grab them." However, there were no trees, coal, or other fuel, nor any stoves and cooking utensils. This did not deter the hungry men who used the stream as a main source to supplement their diet. 2nd Battalion soldiers lived on raw fish and sea rations until kitchens were established on Attic. The command post was moved another mile inland the following day while soldiers retrieved supplies from the beach. The men made several trips from the new command post to the beach in the days that followed to bring food, equipment, and supplies up to the battalion area. Because there were no roads, the men sloshed overland in deep mud, hauling everything from boxes of rations and barracks bags to kitchen stoves and large tents weighing over 225 pounds. From the air, the procession of troops from the command post to the beach and back resembled a colony of ants retrieving food from their hole. Everyone was, quote, "one big mud ball," end quote, cold, wet, and wishing they were back in sunny California. Once 2nd Battalion's command post was established on high ground overlooking Attic, the men traded their rifles for shovels. The unit began to construct an airfield, which had been the primary reason for securing the island. Heavy equipment was brought in to build a road to the airfield to be located on Sweeper Cove. A dike was built and the entire cove was drained. The hardened volcanic ash made a fine airstrip after it had dried, and on September 10th, the first aircraft landed on Attic's runway. A new shipment of steel matting arrived, was hauled to the runway, and installed by the 2nd Battalion soldiers under the watchful eye of Navy Seabees. In all, 2,700 feet of perforated steel landing mat over 100 feet wide was laid by September 13th. The men also built runway revetments and other essential airfield installations. Though the Seabees received most of the credit for runway construction, 2nd Battalion provided the majority of the back-breaking labor. Even after the airfield was completed, the men of 2nd Battalion continued to serve primarily as laborers. They hauled coal, dug trenches, and constructed the Navy's billets while the soldiers themselves spent the cold winter of 1942 and 43 in 6-man pyramid tents. Because Navy personnel were housed closer to the temporary dock and main supply point, and the 2nd Battalion was living in the hills 2 miles from the harbor, the soldiers often were shortchanged. For example, each tent housing 2nd Battalion received a stove, but was issued only 1 sack of coal every 10 days for heating it. During 2nd Battalion's stay on Attic, the men felt they were treated as second-class citizens in regards to equipment, housing, and supplies, while at the same time performing as common laborers. Though large quantities of supplies were stockpiled on Attic, they were allocated for an assault force accumulating on the island, not the troops of the garrison. Eventually, Attic housed over 90,000 soldiers, most of whom were passing through on their way to invade Attu and Kiska. Quote, "We felt that we had been insulted. We had trained for combat for over a year, and we ended up performing menial labor instead of the job we were trained for. It was a low blow to our morale," end quote. Inadequate food added to the battalion's plight. When kitchens finally became operational, the soldiers received their first prepared meal in 7 days. To 2nd Battalion's disgust, its first hot meal on Attic consisted of beans and 1 piece of Spam. Needless to say, the men augmented their diet by fishing during the remainder of their stay on Attic. 2nd Battalion was also forced to scrounge for adequate clothing in the cold, wet climate. When the men were provided with new equipment at Angel Island, they had not been issued any special cold weather gear. The only way that 2nd Battalion obtained cold weather clothing was by trading with the Navy. The sailors liked the Army's wool shirts and trousers, so they exchanged extra parkas and blue wool knit hats for the Army's clothing. This caused many of the soldiers to look remarkably Navy-like, which led to other benefits for 2nd Battalion. The Aleutian Islands defenders received a beer ration on a fairly regular basis. When the 2nd Battalion men learned that the Navy was doling out its beer, they jumped in line with the sailors. After all, they looked like they belonged in the Navy. After a few weeks, the Navy caught on that it was being duped. The Navy then required each man to show his dog tags stamped with the individual's branch of service prior to issuing the beer rations. However, even extra clothing and alcohol could not keep 2nd Battalion from feeling the effects of the weather during the coldest part of the season. Attic's climate was disagreeable for most of the year, particularly during the winter. Cold gales, constant moisture, and daily fog that seldom allowed sunlight to penetrate had been demoralizing, which gradually eroded morale. The winter weather also limited training and outdoor recreational opportunities. Most of the soldiers' off hours were spent playing checkers, cards, and cribbage. Quote, "It was kind of boring," end quote. The worst blow to the men's morale occurred on January 29, 1943. General Order No. 15 redesignated 2nd Battalion of the 134th Infantry as 2nd Battalion of the 197th Infantry. Quote, "We surrendered our colors and guidon, which were shipped back to the 134th, where a new 2nd Battalion was organized from a cadre from 1st and 3rd Battalions," according to Schaefer. The redesignation had, in effect, severed 2nd Battalion's lineage to the Nebraska National Guard and 134th Infantry Regiment. In the spring of 1943, 2nd Battalion's morale improved as the weather began to warm and the soldiers turned their attention to building their own Quonset hut and living quarters. The Navy was adequately housed and the required material was finally allocated to 2nd Battalion. Construction began by cutting and rolling back tundra around the building site. A hole was dug by hand approximately 11 feet deep. Quote, "It seemed like we only got down about an inch or so a day. The ground was frozen and we were digging in volcanic rock," end quote. A semi-cylindrical corrugated metal building was then constructed in the hole. Dirt was piled on the building's top and sides. The tundra was rolled back over the partially buried hut for camouflage, and the only small opening remained as an entryway. Walker noted, quote, "You couldn't see them for 50 yards. Pretty slick," end quote. Once a hut was completed, men from 2 squads moved in, and construction on another one began. About the time 2nd Battalion was comfortably housed, it received word that it would once again become infantrymen instead of laborers. On July 6, 1943, the battalion's spirits rose with the news that it would take part in recapturing Kiska Island. 2 months earlier, American forces had liberated Attu. Kiska now remained as the only Aleutian island under Japanese control. The unit immediately began to train for its new operation. Most of its amphibious warfare training was done on the volcanic island of Great Sitkin, where troops familiarized themselves with captured Japanese machine guns, knee mortars, and hand grenades. On August 10th, 2nd Battalion boarded the USAT Henry Failing, bound for Kiska. 2nd Battalion's mission was to land in the second wave of the assault on the west end of the island near Kiska Volcano. Poor weather delayed the invasion until August 15th. As 2nd Battalion finished its final combat checks and before the soldiers were completely loaded in their landing crafts, word came that Japan had abandoned its base and evacuated all its forces. 2nd Battalion's dejected soldiers never even got off the transport. They quietly filed back into the ship's hold and returned to Attic. 6 months later, 2nd Battalion learned that its Aleutian Islands mission was completed, and it would return to the United States. On April 1st, 1944, 2nd Battalion boarded the USAT Grant and sailed for the Port Edward staging area and Prince Rupert, British Columbia. The battalion remained a week at Fort Rupert. On April 14th, 2nd Battalion boarded troop trains that traveled through the Canadian Rockies, entered the United States at Bellingham, Washington, and passed through Company H's hometown of Grand Island before eventually arrived at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas on April 20th. Every man in the unit immediately received a 21-day pass, the first furlough for most of the soldiers in over 2 years. The accomplishments of the battalion and the Aleutians earned it a commendation that was read into the Congressional Record by Senator Harry S. Truman. When 2nd Battalion returned from its leave, it was broken up and men sent to training camps all across the nation. Some were used as cadre to begin new units. Others managed to get transferred back to the 134th and saw combat in Europe. 2nd Battalion's special top secret mission to the Aleutian Islands did not turn out to be the glamour assignment that some had expected. Quote, "We thought we would go up there, give the Japanese a knockout blow, and return to the 134th as heroes. But it sure did not turn out that way." End quote. The harsh climate, the battalion's use primarily as labor force, its failure to see combat, and its eventual disbandment resulted in its service being overlooked. Few Nebraskans realize that an American possession and future state was invaded by Japan during World War II. Fewer still realize that a former Nebraska National Guard battalion was deployed to help stop Japanese expansion in the area. When homecoming parades in 1945 and 1946 were organized in Omaha, Lincoln, North Platte, and other towns in Nebraska to celebrate the return of the 134th Infantry Regiment and its commander, Brigadier General Butler B. Miltenberger, 2nd Battalion's Aleutian Island veterans were not included. Despite this lack of recognition, the Aleutian service of the 2nd Battalion did not disappear from the record of the 134th Infantry Regiment. Just before the battalion, then part of the 197th, was broken up, an Aleutian Islands campaign streamer was authorized for the unit's guidance. Because the 2nd Battalion was to be disbanded, its commander, Lieutenant Colonel C.J. Stewart, forwarded the citation for the streamer to the Nebraska Adjutant General. Today, the colors of the Nebraska National Guard's 134th Infantry Regiment proudly include a streamer marked Aleutian Campaign. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of History Nebraska, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.